Welcome everyone. We hope that you and your families are doing well and staying safe. We're happy to host you today in the fifth and final webinar of our series on active Palestinian archives, preserving Palestinian culture and heritage. These webinars have addressed collective or formal forms of archiving, whether by museums, scholars, or institutions. And today we have a different approach. The People's Archive, Personalizing and Accessing Palestinian History, offers an alternative and intimate perspective on how to view and use personal items of everyday Palestinian communities across 3 continents. It allows us to look at the Palestinian people's familial belongings and their place in the Palestinian narrative. It also allows us to look at the ways in which the people recreate a representation of their history in posters and artwork. We have today a wonderful lineup of panelists who have so much to share, from personal stories, academic success, or community building. From Baranquilla, Colombia, Brighton, UK, Bethlehem, Palestine, and Washington DC. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to ask you to feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen and send us your questions for the panelists for the end. I will begin by introducing our panelists today. We have Odette Yidi David. She is a Colombian-Palestinian researcher, cultural activist, and adjunct professor of the Department of History and Social Sciences at Universidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia. She also serves as the director of the Institute of Arab Culture of Colombia, which is an educational organization that promotes intercultural dialogue between Colombia and the Arab world. She has curated several Palestinian tatreez and mother-of-pearl art exhibitions. Dr. Zena Mahasri is a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton, UK. Before taking up her post at Brighton, she was both an independent graphic designer and an academic at the American University of Beirut. She is the author of Off the Wall, Political Posters of the Lebanese Civil War, and curator of related traveling exhibitions and online archival resources, one of which she will be presenting today. Her most recent book is Cosmopolitan Radicalism, the Visual Politics of Beirut's Global 60s, which explores the transnational circuits that animated Arab modernist pursuits and sheds light on the forgotten trajectories and graphic design practices of its protagonists, who are Egyptian, Iraqi, Lebanese, Palestinian, and Syrian artists who wove through Beirut in and out of its flourishing art galleries, publishing industry, and political movements. Jojo Amman is an academic, researcher, and collector in the fields of Palestinian art and material culture. He's the advisor to the Bank of Palestine Group in fields of art, culture, and diaspora. And he is founder of Dar el-Sabagh Diaspora Studies and Research Center, which he will be talking about today. He is also a consultant to the Scientific Committee for the Terra Sancta Museum of the Custody of the Holy Land. And finally, of course, last but not least, from the Museum of the Palestinian People is Nizar Farsakh. He is a trainer focusing on leadership, advocacy, and negotiations. He worked for 2 years at the Project on Middle East Democracy in DC, building the advocacy capacity of Arab CSOs. And before that, he was the general director of the PLO delegation in Washington, DC for 2 years. He also advised senior Palestinian leaders, including the president, the prime minister, and various ministries. And he is currently involved in several nonviolence initiatives in Palestine and the United States, and he's the chairman of the Museum of the Palestinian People. I leave the floor to you, Odette, if you can start.
Thank you, Laura, and I am very happy to be joining from Colombia and very proud to share this space with people that I admire very deeply and that I hope I can become like them someday. Also, I would like to thank you all for joining. I feel that this is a very important chapter in the collective struggle of the Palestinians and the Palestinian narrative. At the end, I feel that sometimes we cannot control some of the things that happen beyond our diasporic borders. So we are left to embrace our Palestinianness from our diasporic dwellings. And this is how my family came in contact with their Palestinianness, precisely through art, through archives, through the personal, familiar, and also the diasporic stories of our community. So as to give you a broad example or an idea of who we are in Colombia. As you may know, Palestinians are in Latin America. They have been in Latin America, Central America also for over 100 years. They came during the Ottoman period. They began coming during the Ottoman period, and they obviously continued coming after the Nakba. My mother's side came after the Nakba. My father's side came before the Nakba from Bethlehem. And Colombia is not the biggest community, of course. We have 500,000 Palestinians in Chile. We have a huge community in El Salvador. But there is a community in Colombia. Usually people know Colombia for the Lebanese immigrants, which are many, of course, which are more than Palestinians, but there is a vibrant Palestinian community, especially where I live, which is in the northern region of the country, in the Caribbean. So we do exist, and that is precisely where I want to begin. Why are the personal histories important for us? It's a personal feeling, and I would say that I feel that Latin American, Central American Palestinian communities have been marginalized for many decades until recent. For example, with Dar el Sabah, a marvelous initiative in Bethlehem, we've been able to reconnect. But before, almost all the work was very political, very scarce, and maybe it was because of a distance barrier, geographic distance, or maybe because a linguistic barrier, or maybe because the communities in Latin America were formed before the Nakba, the biggest communities. Maybe all of these reasons had an impact on how these communities see themselves. So now we have fourth generation, fifth generation Palestinians who are not necessarily aware of their heritage. And it is very hard also in a society where Palestine has been very stigmatized due to the internal conflict and the internal situation of Colombia. So there are many factors that affect the way in which the Colombian-Palestinian community has developed. Of course, there has been a lot of movement, there has been a lot of initiatives, organizations, events, exhibitions throughout the years. I remember my parents being very active in the 90s, and that's how I became active, because of them. And when I look at their pictures organizing community events, exhibitions, I was there. So also that's to share a little bit the importance of family work. You know, when among the family you see other members doing something for Palestine, somehow you get involved. And that's what happened in my case. So I feel that because of all these reasons, we have been somehow marginalized from the broader discourses and narratives of Palestine. Sometimes we're only studied as the Palestinian diaspora, how we came here, how we settled in Chile, or why we settled in Colombia, our businesses, how the pioneers managed to enter the country. That's the majority of the research done. But there is a whole other narrative that has to be shared as well. And that's precisely what I want to share with you today. So I will begin showing you, a presentation, some pictures that I have gathered over the years from my parents' work. And what I want to convey is the importance, or rather the very much popular phrase that the personal is political, but in the case of Palestine and in the diaspora in Colombia, it is very political, because as I will tell you with these pictures, my father, who is this one here, I don't know if you can see my pointer. Nope. Okay. The one in the corner, in the right corner, and my mother is in the other corner. They took their family histories, the familiar histories of the diaspora in Colombia, and they managed to revive an ancient, not an ancient, but a very old Palestinian art. And that's for me a very strong political statement. So as you can see, my parents were always with the community, other community members like Patricia Buchaibe, and other many people that I don't want to mention, because then I don't mention all of them and I get into trouble. So they were always very active. My father and Patricia actually created this room at the local Arab club very Alhambra inspired, very Moorish, but that's another story for later. And they used it as a cultural center. This was in the early 1990s. They did events, they had an exhibition, they gave courses on Arabic history, culture, Palestine, whatever. So they were always very active. We as a community published also, for example, magazines. We made these magazines possible with the help of members of the community who would contribute economically. It was a very beautiful initiative. I was part of it until 2008. But what I want to focus on is in the art of mother of pearl, which is something that usually is in the sidelines when we talk about Palestinian art. Usually tatreez gets a lot of attention because there are many, many important tatreez artists lately, which I admire. But mother of pearl perhaps doesn't get that much visual attention. So how did my father and our family began interested in the art of mother of pearl carving? Basically, my great-grandfather visited Bethlehem in 1950. After coming to Colombia, he went back and he bought up a coat of arms, a Last Supper from Bishara Subbi, an important master in Bethlehem. He brought the art piece to Colombia, and many decades later, my father received this art piece, and he was intrigued by the work. He didn't know much about it by then, just what everyone knows about mother of pearl, which is the small souvenirs that people get when they go to Bethlehem, but nothing else. So he began doing research with my mother and another Colombian historian, and they published this book in 2004, which is in Spanish, I'm sorry, and it's the first book that narrates, reconstructs, and preserves the history of mother of pearl done in the diaspora, done in Colombia. The coat of arms that you see in the book was gifted by a Palestinian family that came to Colombia in the 1920s. It was a gift for the Colombian authorities. And this coat of arms is today in the office of the governor of our city. You can see a bit of the coat of arms here. He was a previous governor. So it's in his office, right, next to Simón Bolívar. So this was the pretext of my parents doing this very extensive research. They went several times to Bethlehem. My father also went to many private collections in Europe, to museums, the Vatican museums in Russia, in the US, Italy, to try to reconstruct the story of mother of pearl, because this story has also been taken away from us. It's all in Europe or in the diaspora, because this art was precisely something used by Palestinians for important people. I mean, it was, yes, there was this line for pilgrims, for souvenirs, religious souvenirs made of mother of pearl since the 16th century, but then there was this other line of workshops that made art, and it was gifted to important figures for obviously political favors or other things. So he made this book with my mother, and then he opened his own workshop in Colombia in 1998. This is a webpage if you want to. This is him with one of the artisans. The workshop is all made by Colombian artisans that have been trained by my father in this art. He has learned it from masters in Bethlehem, from books, from observation, and he has been able to rescue this art and open a workshop in Colombia. And the workshop is fortunately still open, doing art. They make art inspired in all the techniques, motifs of traditional Palestinian art of mother of pearl. He also restores, I don't know if that's the word, but he fixes maybe some old pieces that are in private collections. And now he's doing his own artwork. He has recently designed this collection of shells, huge Australian mother of pearl shells, engraved with different motifs. taking a little bit of distance from the traditional art of Palestinian art of religious symbolism and coats of arms of royal houses or countries, and he has now developed his own style, very contemporary, in which he also includes a lot of colors and all other shells because we're in the Caribbean. So he tries to combine all of these different elements. This is a shell that tells the story of Bethlehemite immigrants arriving to Colombia in the early 20th century. So you see a lot of Colombian local species. You see the mother and the children with their traditional thoughts and the immigration official. He also makes other shows inspired in actual events of Palestine, like stories and images of Palestine, like for example, the cabbage sellers. And like this, we have over 100 shells that he's done. We were able to create a museum to house his collection because besides doing his own art, he also collects pieces. And also, for example, old instruments, pictures of the old masters and workshops in Bethlehem. So we were able to do this museum, but unfortunately, it's closed. Yeah, to the public right now. That's another story. And finally, we do some exhibitions. We have to do it in shopping malls because in my city there are not many cultural venues. So this last year we did it at a shopping mall, trying to make a connection between Bethlehem and Barranquilla. And this connection is done through the diaspora, right? Through the historical ties between these two cities, because this city has many, many Bethlehemite immigrants. Sorry, recently the workshop has done several important artworks. One was gifted to Prince Charles during his visit to Bethlehem, and this one was commissioned by a friend in Qatar, and it's now in the Museum of Islamic Art in Qatar. So I finish now, and thank you for listening. Later we will answer some other questions.
Thank you so much, Odette. These are very interesting. I put Odette's Instagram handle in the chat. You can all follow her there. She has a lot of similar information on the Palestinian community in the Caribbean and in Colombia. George, if you would like to go ahead with your presentation.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to start with you all. Okay, so I'll just give a quick background about myself and about my act of collecting. Actually, I started collecting since the age of 5. I started collecting stamps, coins, etc. And my act of collecting just shifted from stamps at the beginning to coins, and then with the influence of my family's background, my family is deeply rooted into the industry of the mother of pearl carving, again, following, adding to what Odette said. Actually, I worked with my father in his souvenir shop since I was a little kid. I used to go there and I got influenced. And then I went abroad to study art history and to study the history of iconography, Christian iconography. And then I started collecting Palestinian material culture. The screen you are seeing is some few examples of my collection. I do have a huge collection of mother of pearl artifact. Maybe it's the biggest worldwide. I have here a model for the Church of the Nativity. It is one of the 3 known surviving models. I have in the collection some dresses from all over Palestine, but focusing mainly on the city of Bethlehem. I have the modern contemporary art. I'm showing here a super rare piece by Najil Ali, an original piece by Najil Ali. I'm showing also a painting by the late Samir Salame. I'm showing also a mother of pearl shell signed by Abu Fhaile, an Armenian pottery vase, and also books and manuscripts. While starting my collection and the act of collecting, I started 20 years ago professionally. I always collected books and manuscripts, whether I was collecting mother of pearl, I was collecting dresses, the act of collecting books and manuscripts continued from 20 years till today. And actually, I work as a consultant for the Bank of Palestine group. And one of my things that I have to do in the bank, of my duties at the bank, is to make research actually about people in diaspora. And when I conduct research for people in diaspora, it was in order to convince those people, starting in 2012, to come back to Palestine in order to invest in Palestine through the Bank of Palestine. So I started amassing with my late friend Nada Atrash and my colleague Khalil Shoke here at the center, the Dar Sabah Center for Diaspora and Research Studies. I started amassing much information in regards of people in diaspora. So from 2012 till 2020 today, until 2018, especially before the inauguration of the Dar Sabah Center, I started collecting and amassing much ready research about families and people in diaspora. From that point, in Dar Sabah, we can see today at Dar Sabah, we are offering our services for all people from diaspora coming to ask about their origins, about their families. They need information. As Odette said, the connection was lost in a way. So our job at Dar Sabah is to provide information for the families coming from diaspora before the COVID-19 period, asking about all kind of information in regards of their families and their history pre-diaspora, pre-leaving Palestine, before leaving Palestine. So in Dar Sabah, we are focusing, and our archives are consisting of, let's say, 5 components. We have a huge archive which belonged to my great-grandfather Jacobo Al-A'ma, or Jacob Al-A'ma, who used to live the majority of his life in Santiago, Chile, and he returned to Bethlehem in 1901, bringing back with him his diaries. I'm showing here on the screen an example of one of his 14 diaries, and on the cover pages he's writing the addresses of his family and friends and relatives in all over the globe. You can see addresses in Santiago, Chile. You can see addresses in Barranquilla, Colombia. So one of the major components we have here at Dar Sabah is the archive of Jacob Lama. We have here also the archives donated to me and to my personal collection by Helen Sim'an. And we need not only personal archives, but we need also archives that used to belong to churches. When it comes to the Greek Orthodox Church in Bethlehem, the archives were lost because each priest, when he dies, his family would take the archive. Some people would throw it away, some people would keep it. In the case of Helen Sim'an, her great-grandfather was a very important Orthodox priest in Bethlehem. She kept his archive and she donated this 2 years ago to my collection. I'm showing here also some photos for the archives of the priest Sim'an. One of the major books we have here at Dar Sabah in the manuscript box or drawers, we have here a manuscript written in Latin America by a writer whose name is Hanna Musa Al-Ka'ik. Al-Ka'ik is a family that doesn't exist anymore in Bethlehem. The last member from Al-Ka'ik family existed in Bethlehem and lived in Bethlehem during the 1930s. And here you can see at the bottom right side of the book and the picture you are seeing in front of you, his signature, and he stated that clearly, that he wrote this in Latin America. And especially he wrote the majority of this book. It's a 670 pages book. He wrote it mainly in Santiago, Chile, and you can see also some Spanish writing all over the right piece I chose to show you from this manuscript. And to tell you a brief history about Dar Sabah before I continue showing parts of my archives that I rely on with my team at Dar Sabah to produce, let's say, research and papers for diaspora, for our people in diaspora. Dar Sabah was established in 2018. In 2016, Mr. Alberto Cassis from Santiago, Chile, originally from Bethlehem, gave me personally the green light to buy back a third out of 3 pieces of his mother's house, Dar al-Sabbagh, the very famous house which is located today on Star Street, which is part of the World Heritage List of the UNESCO. This house, after we bought it, Mr. Alberto gave it to us as a CCHP Center for Cultural Heritage Preservation in order to establish what is known today Dar al-Sabbagh. And the CCHP actually renovated it and we inaugurated it in 2018. Mr. Alberto is donating monthly all the expenses needed for running the center. I'm here the founder of the center, and I have a very interesting team of 3 people led by Mr. Khalil Shoke. We have Iyad Hamdal and Manal Abu Ayyash also with us. We based our services that are given for free for all of our people in diaspora on the archives. That's why I'm telling you about the archives tonight. The major piece we have is a book I own personally and part of my collection, and you can see it in front of you today. This book I bought by chance from someone who was teaching at Tarasanta School here in Bethlehem, and before he immigrated to Sweden, he called me in order to offer me his collection of manuscripts, and after negotiations I have bought them, and the masterpiece in them was this book written by the late priest Elia Banayot, who happened to be the great-grandfather of Mr. Alberto, the owner of the house of Dar al-Sabbagh. And within this book, he started writing in it in 1858, lies the names of all the Orthodox community in Bethlehem from 1858 till 1922, which is the death of this priest. You can't imagine how many names were missing from the history of Bethlehem, and 90% of the names are people in diaspora. So by having this book, we started at Dar al-Sabbagh offering really professional services to our community in diaspora, and especially by pinpointing and by shedding a light on their histories. So before COVID-19 period, people used to come to knock our doors, and we used to offer them, I will show you later, many ready research and many ready papers for each and every family. We have here another, let's say, example from my personal archive, which is part of the Dar al-Sabbagh archives today. We can see a book written by another priest dating back to 1773, an 18th century Bethlehemite manuscript. When we started, actually, I tried to give my team the most professional training, and with the help of the IPS, I'm thanking the IPS, all of the directors, all of the workers at the IPS, especially the Ramallah team, for helping my team in order how to proceed, how to work in a more professional way with the documents I have in Dar al-Sabbagh. You can see here Professor Salim Tamari and all the team. And today, the majority of my personal archive that used to belong to my great-grandfather is well kept in asset-free material, documented, scanned, fully digitized, and also the archives of Helen Sim'an, the Cassis family, all the books and manuscripts that belongs to my personal archive. Also, we are relying on our huge, deep connections with the churches. To put aside the Orthodox Church, which we have its records, especially for the people in Bethlehem, we have great connections with the Catholic Church, with the Syriac Church, and we have also a copy of the Islamic Ottoman courts, which is having also the list and the names of all the Muslims and all the Christians of the city of Bethlehem and the governorate in general. You can see here an example of how do we keep our archives. And this is an example of the, let's say, the research the church is offering since 1512. There was a decree from the Pope of the Vatican for the Catholic Church in Bethlehem and in Palestine in general to start archiving. So we have access to those archives dating more than 500 years, and we are using them. And here on the right side of the screen, you can see also an example from the Ottoman census, which is the Sijillat al-Mahakim al-Shar'iyya, the Islamic Ottoman courts. We have here also showing you a final, let's say, research, how we present our research for the families. You can see here a research conducted for the Abu Hamame family from Bethlehem, from the Hrizat quarter. You can see the table of contents, how we have an introduction about Bethlehem, we have introduction about the Hrizat quarter, we have specific history of the Abu Hamame family. If we have photos, we can give photos for the family. If we have maps for their houses, for the locations of their businesses, also graves. We go to graves and we show people the graves of their ancestors. So this is actually a glimpse of what we do at Dar al-Sabbagh. Thank you for listening. I hope I showed you enough about what we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George, for all of this. I, again, pasted the link to all the information you can find on Dar al-Sabbagh in the chat, the right chat this time. And now I leave the floor to Dr. Zena Mahasri.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Laura. And I'm really pleased to be part of this panel. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to just share my screen, or attempt to. So I'm just going to, as Laura has asked me to actually talk a bit about the collection of visual and cultural and print culture that I came to use for my recent book, and which in fact dates back to a period of the Palestinian revolutionary period from the 60s and 70s, which also tells us it's visual and material culture that tells us about the everyday history of that revolution. Most of this material was published with, I'm going just to give you show some examples and talk about how I came to use this collection. And most of this material was produced in Beirut in the late 60s and 70s. It's a critical moment, a revolutionary moment when Beirut came to be known as the Arab Hanoi, basically as a bridge and springboard for the liberation of Palestine, just as Hanoi was for South Vietnam. It acted as a node, and that's mainly what I try to focus on in the chapter 5 and 6 of my book, how Beirut acted as a node of transnational solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle, specifically in terms of the arts of solidarity at that time, particularly the printed everyday material. The thing is that when I began to work on this project, the collection itself was not readily available, and it's not something that you will easily find in institutional archives. And so it took time to collect, but I began to discover that bit by bit. So I draw in different collections, some of it private, some of it my own. I'm happy to respond to questions about that later on. But the idea is that I came across this collection when I was working on the project on the political posters of the Lebanese Civil War, which is a project that I began before this book, and I worked on from 2003. In this project, I had focused specifically on the political posters of the civil war in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990. And it's through this that I began to discover the importance of the political posters for solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. But in that book, in that previous project, I had to focus only on the Palestinian posters that were concerned directly with the civil war. But there was so much more material that needed work, development and work beyond just looking at posters and beyond just looking at the framework of the civil war. But what is important for me here in this project is that I began to discover how much the Lebanese political parties which were on the left had built their aesthetic experience or their experience of art, revolutionary art, on the Palestinian experience before that. So, and there were lots of chances of collaborations and workshops between artists to produce posters of solidarity, but also pamphlets and all sorts of printed material that are part of the everyday of that moment, of that historical moment. So in that sense, it led me to begin to want to do more research about how Beirut became that space after the war in 1967, that space of solidarity for different Arab artists who came in and joined that struggle. One of the key examples, like the artist I began to follow, is Helmi Touni, who is an Egyptian artist. You can see his poster, the one on the on my right, at least the red one, which is the American-Israeli peace in Lebanon, the red one with the Israeli fighter plane. So this is a poster he did for the Communist Action Organization in Lebanon, but Helmi Touni was an Egyptian artist who had relocated to Lebanon and worked for different Palestinian organizations and publishers. So I began to look for his work. He did a lot of work, for instance, with one of the key publishing houses in Beirut, the المؤسسة العربية للدراسات والنشر, the Arab Institute for Publishing, for Research and Publishing, with these two covers here that are for Mahmoud Darwish's poetry. But he did posters, and he in fact stayed in Beirut from 1973 to 1982-83, so for 10 years. Doing that kind of work. And it was also an important moment because he was someone who was working for, was the art director in Cairo for one of the key publishing houses, Dar al-Hilal, and he had to relocate when Sadat came to power in Egypt because he lost his work. And it's a different long political story, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. Helmi Touni, tracing basically the work of Helmi Touni, I came to Dar al-Fata al-Arabi, which might be familiar for many Palestinian generations of Palestinians who've read these children. It's an important radical publishing house that was founded in Beirut in 1974 and was developed by the Palestine Planning Center, which at that time was headed by Nabil Shaath, and he had, so the project of Dar al-Fata began with Nabil Shaath and another militant Egyptian committed to the Palestinian struggle, Mahgoub Omar. So it was also, this is a project that was born out of that revolutionary moment, to which Helmi Touni did a lot of illustrations, but he was also not the only one who was doing the illustrations for children's books, as I'll show you in a minute. But in fact, also that looking at the project of Dar al-Fata, one important precursor to Dar al-Fata al-Arabi is a project that the artist Muna Saoudi had begun, and that actually garnered attention to children specifically after 1967. So Palestinian children's traumatic experiences of displacement and exile, and basically their effective lives in the camps specifically after 67. So she actually spent time in refugee camps between 1968 and 1969 with children aged between 5 and 14 to help them narrate their experiences, but also express visually their emotions and their lives in the camps, their experiences of displacement and lives in the camps through drawings. And these drawings were compiled together and put into an exhibition that traveled to different places with Muna Saoudi, and then compiled into this book that she edited that was trilingual in English, Arabic, and French. And the idea was that it was also a way to fund a possible art center in refugee camps for children. What's interesting here is in relation to Dar al-Fata, so both the attention to children at that moment, but also that the image that you see on the cover of the book, which is a drawing, a child's drawing of a bird flying very high next to the sun, is actually what became Dar al-Fata's logo. So there are connections, and in fact, this is The logo itself for Dar al-Fata the idea for the logo was done by the Palestinian artist Kamal Boulata, who sadly left us last year. So he worked with Mona Saoudi. He was originally the founding art director of Dar al-Fata, and worked with Mona Saoudi to choose an illustration that worked as a symbol for the publishing house. That Kamal Boulata left Dar al-Fata as he had to leave to the Lebanon to the US. And the person who replaced him is another Egyptian illustrator and artist, Muhyiddin al-Labbad, and a political cartoonist who became took over as the art director for Dar al-Fata, and lived in Beirut for a few years before going back and continuing the project from Cairo in '77. So this is one of his earliest projects, a book with Dar al-Fata. It's Al-Bayt, the home, it's an illustrated book by a story by Zakaria Tamer, who was a Syrian short story writer, who actually wrote a lot of children's stories for Dar al-Fata. So this book, in fact, is very interesting, and I actually spend most of the last chapter on the story of this book, because it's a book that traveled. It was published in 1974 or 75, in fact, but it traveled before being released in Beirut. It traveled with Yasser Arafat to the United Nations headquarters in 1974. And it was translated to many languages, at least 7 languages, and was distributed on the delegates. So it's a beautiful but also a controversial story, but that I tried to unpack in the last chapter. So this is also just to give an example of how these little, it's a tiny object, it's a tiny book that you can hold within the palm of your hand, but that actually gets to move across places as well. And it's through digging more into Dar al-Fata that one begins to discover how it was in itself a site and a node for transnational Arab solidarity among artists. So it wasn't just so you had Helmi Touni or Muhyiddin al-Labbad, who were the Egyptian artists who joined that project. But with them, there were many other Egyptian illustrators, some who relocated also for 2 years and worked together with Muhyiddin al-Labbad for an intensive time to produce close to 70 books within the 60-something books in the first year of the launching of the project. But also you had Syrian artists such as Yusuf Abdelki, example here, or Burhan Karkutli, who's done beautiful illustrations for a compiled series of compiled short stories by Ghassan Kanafani, the children of Ghassan Kanafani. But besides, there's also there's Kamal Boulata, who also did some illustrations for these books. So the point for me was these artistic expressions of solidarity do not feature in any of the history of Palestinian art, not even Boulata's own book on Palestinian art. So it's a category of art that is not given sufficient attention. It's not given attention in Arab art generally. It's art that is used in print, that becomes ephemeral, that is not like the painting or not like, so it's something I try to question and try to give more importance to, because this is part of the sense of the everyday imagination and struggle that people lived and produced, and commitments that they were gives us a testimony to the commitments and collaborations. What was interesting also for me so this collection, as I was trying to locate this and I was teaching in Beirut to graphic design students, and began to show this material because students in graphic design were eager to see examples of previous designers and illustrators from the Arab world, and particularly with these issues around identity and struggle. And then it's also that the collection began to grow as I'd have students who actually grew up on these books, and they would bring them to me. So so some of these collections are also documented from some of my former students and friends whose parents were part of this project, and then it unravels a whole story. But it also unravels something that's important. That's besides Dar al-Fata. Dar al-Fata was just one site in which these artistic collaborations developed, specifically in relation to both a sense of solidarity and commitment to the Palestinian cause, but also with the idea of a revolutionary hope for that generation at that time, for the broader Arab world. Beirut, so that there's Dar al-Fata, but there's other sites in which these collaborations materialize. One of the examples, the earliest example I could trace was this project for the Friends of Jerusalem, by the Friends of Jerusalem, which was done just in 1968 as a series of solidarity posters, which were compiled by another important figure in Beirut, artist Odette Yidi, but he asked different Arab artists to submit work, to send work, and some of the proceeds would also be used for charitable causes. So here we have artists from Iraq, now very famous, Dia Al-Azawi, Qadim Haidar, and also Jumana Husseini. It's a whole series of posters where art gets to be democratized and reproduced in the everyday to stand for a political issue. But further than that, there's also been examples of artwork that goes from posters to little books and children's books, but also to postcards and to stamps. And these same artists had their work in these everyday forms of prints and visual culture. So here we have a series of postcards that were produced by the PLO for the 10th anniversary of the Palestinian Revolution in 1975, and it features here the work of Muna Saoudi again, Muhyiddin al-Labad, and Kamal Boulata. And in fact, both Kamal Boulata's and Muna Saoudi's work, these illustrations, were used before in 1969 and 70 in the periodical Al-Hadaf, which was by the organ of the PFLP, Jabha al-Sha'biyya. And so it's interesting to see how these arts circulated and were part of that. They're part of the visuals of the revolution of the time. And so basically in fact, the posters that I've shown by Odette Yidi, he did that in 68, but he was then asked in 69 by Fatah to reproduce the same project in a series of stamps. So you'd see these artworks again on stamps, and that sense of a mail art that gets to circulate, that crosses borders in a way that people were not allowed to. So it is an interesting idea to think about that material form of art that is not a painting, but that can be easily reproduced and that can be transmitted across borders. So here, these postcards show that same idea and show that sort of how there's a sense in these prints that there's an aesthetics of hope that was crucial to the revolutionary moment, that was part of one's everyday life, that gave a sense of agency to those who were represented and those for whom these narratives were important. And it's that sense of agency that foregrounded the Palestinian struggle as a revolution, as for the Arab world, basically, and that was galvanized through solidarity. It's something. It's today in recent studies or interest in the Arab uprisings, there's more and more interest in that relation between aesthetics and politics, and that everyday sense of struggle in attention to the everyday subjective transformation and politicization of the youth, in public protest, in the affective dimension of protest and the arts, graffiti, etc. And we know how important these are if we live them, but it's important to go back historically to understand the importance of this material that had not been given that historical importance. This has, I mean, it's referred to as archival ephemera, and had not been given the same archival importance to documents, but it's also an important testimony to that everyday history of the Palestinian struggle, or of solidarity with it. It's not treaties or agreements or that leaders, it's not the voices of leaders and diplomats, but it's that it's a people's history. It's and it's in fact that cultural politics that testify basically of this material, that testify to the collective imaginaries of hope and dreams, basically, of radical futures of people in their everyday life. And it's, I just will end here, and just to say that this is an important study, but also important material to be collected and guarded against the historical erasure that we might contribute to by not giving them the importance that they deserve. That's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahasri. These are fantastic, and I'm sure that the attendees they've already sent in a few questions about what you spoke about that we'll revisit in the Q&A. Please, everyone, if you have any questions, send them through the Q&A. We will move now to the Museum of the Palestinian People with Nizar Farsakh. You can go ahead.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Zena. It's a perfect segue to what I want to cover, which is how we can, what's out there, and what role can we play to conserve, not only conserve those stories and those artifacts, but part of what the museum is about is pride in the heritage, but also renewal. How do we repurpose our heritage for contemporary purposes, right? So that we can thrust it into the future, right? And make it relevant, as opposed to just an act of nostalgia. And we want it to be the fuel for the creativity of the future, right? I'll do my best to, I have 10 places I want to show you guys. I'm going to share my screen. So basically, I'm going to spend a minute on each one of them. So basically, I'm going to quickly show the Palestinian Museum's virtual tour. I'm going to talk at the end about the museum again. And then the different sources of oral history that I think that we found and we thought are useful and worth spending time on. Palestine Remembered, the Palestine Oral History Archive, Arab American Stories, Palestinians podcast. There's also an Australian one that I found, but also FOSNA, Friends of Sabil North America. They train on how to tell your narrative. They train Palestinians on how to tell their narratives. It's an amazing project. And also Storycorps, which is an American organization. They have something that is community Storycorps. We did that back in 2019. I'll speak about that. And then I'll just give an example of the other part of the story that I think is just as important, which is when others speak about us or tell our story and the dangers of that. And Yazan does an amazing job of the voice of the subject and how, of course, that applies to all people that have been othered by colonialism and brings the Palestinian case. And for us as Palestinians, the whole inspiration for the museum is the sense that we as Palestinians, our main challenge is that our story has been told by others, and it's high time that we had a space to tell our own stories, our own ways, right? So without further ado, I'll just quickly go through those websites, I guess. And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna share this in the chat so that you have the links as we speak. And I need to stop to be able to share on the chat, okay. All panelists and attendees, yes. Oh, it didn't take all of them. Okay, I'll take this way. It took half of them. Okay. So, so the Museum of the Palestinian People was started by Bshara Nassar, who's a great guy from Bethlehem. His family. I won't go into a story. It's a nice story, but we don't have time for it, unfortunately. Now, maybe I can tell it in the Q&A. But the basic point is that he felt that when he came to DC, he felt that the museums in DC do an amazing job in really getting you in other people's worlds and in getting immersed in other people's stories. And he sensed the absence of the Palestinian story. Where am I? Where is my story, right? So back in 2014, he started what was called the Nakba Museum, and it evolved into the Museum of the Palestinian People because we wanted to, I joined in 2017 as the chair of the board, and we wanted to make it a larger conversation, not just about Nakba, but about us as a people, and the focus on the people and not just the place, because we want people to connect with people, right? We want the visitors to connect with us as human beings so that they start to care about what's happening to us. We first need to get them to care before we give them the information or getting them to want to know more about our predicament and our challenges, because if they don't care, it doesn't matter what amount of facts we throw at them, it's not going to have the same effect. But if they care, they're going to be curious, they're going to be invested in knowing why are these amazing Palestinian people who are so inspiring, why are they still suffering, why are they still not free, and they would want to support individually. So that's the ethos of the museum. Now, we were very inspired by the fact that many people loved the exhibits. They ended up in 3.5 years. They went to 50 locations in the US. And one of a couple that visited the exhibit in New York, in Manhattan, New York, was so impressed and inspired. They said, we have this space in DuPont Circle in Washington, DC, which is a very great cultural center in DC. You can have it free of charge for 2 years. So we were really moved by this generosity. And they're not even Palestinian, they're just white American folk. But they were really inspired by how the curation touched them, right? They connected to it. So we opened the museum last year. It's a small space, it's 800 square feet, and like 90 square meters. And we had exhibits in it. I'll quickly show you something called the virtual exhibit. So I'm showing you on the website so that you know how to get there. There's the website of the museum. You go to visit, and then down the choice virtual museum. And this was, I guess, very propitious in the sense that another person, average American, has nothing to do with Palestine, a cartographer, geographer, GIS expert, was inspired by the museum, and he offered to create this virtual exhibit for people who cannot come to the museum. So he created this virtual exhibit, again, free of charge. You go in and you can see the different parts, different sections, click to learn more, right? Here's an important map that we show in 1938, shows Palestine, but also shows Bible lands. It's a National Geographic map of the Holy Land. And this is what I was talking about, how our story is told by others. And we show this at the beginning to show people that one of our main challenges is, here is a National Geographic map of 1938. And the map says Bible lands, cradle of Western civilization. So the story of the Palestinians not only is being told by non-Palestinians, but is being told for non-Palestinian purposes. And that's a big chunk of our predicament. And that's why we need to not only regain our narrative, but to broadcast it loud and, which is very important, in ways relevant to the listeners. And that's what we try to do in the museum. I'm not gonna go through the tour, but you can go to the tour, click on different parts, And there are different sections. There's also a section of where Palestinians are today, making their mark, which is an important theme that we have, that after you see all the adversity that Palestinians have gone through, the last thing you see is where are Palestinians now, right? And the amazing things they're doing, Edward Said, Rashida Tlaib, DJ Khalid, and so on and so forth. So that's about the museum. I'm gonna maybe come back if I have a bit of time. The other website is Palestine Remembered. We found that this is the one with the most comprehensive oral histories. They have around 600, of which many are videos. And what I love about it is that it is, I can't see the chat, so if there is anything urgent, Laura, please tell me.
No worries.
Okay, if somebody's not following or something, right? What they did is that they created it, and the refugees started populating the website with images and videos and recordings. So I love this work because it's kind of like a community effort, which I think this is what we need. We need a place where we as Palestinians can exist virtually, let's say, so that we can have this conversation and not be, and transcend the geographic boundaries we have. And it's kind of the similar experience that we've had in the museum. Is we thought we were experts on Palestine and Palestinian issues. And as they say, build and they will come. After we opened the museum, we discovered so many amazing, talented Palestinians that are up to amazing things, often no good. But I mean, that was the most inspiring lesson we had. Is once, I mean, they say the Titanic was built by professionals, while Noah's Ark was built by amateurs. So we were very hesitant to start the museum because we weren't museum experts. We knew that we needed to start somewhere. And once we started, things started happening and people started coming and we started discovering. And the museum became a hub for people to meet and discover and be proud of the Palestinian heritage and do something about it. And this is a key thing also. One of our objectives in the museum is that you go into the museum. The whole point is for you to be touched and moved. And at the end, we ask you 3 questions on a board and you can write your notes. What surprised you? I forgot the second one. But the more important one, how do you see yourself as part of the story, right? We do not want people to leave the museum without a call to action, an invitation to be part of this community, because we're not only interested in the Palestinian story as, you know, Palestinians are amazing and an act of Palestinian chauvinism and like we're such an amazing people. On the contrary, we want to tell our Palestinian story, our human story, so that the visitor sees what connects us as human beings. We want it as a platform for the larger universal conversation. We want to be leaders in this universal conversation of making this world a better place, starting with the Palestinian story. So for us, the museum is not a presentation and more a conversation, right? We want it to be a start of a relationship, not the end of a relationship. And what I find great in Palestine Remembered is that it's this great resource where you can just go and browse through it and add stuff from your village, your own ways, right? So each village is proud of its heritage and it decides what is or is not important. Another one is, of course, a joint project of AUB and the Institute for Palestine Studies, and I believe also the museum in Birzeit, the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit, where they have this map and you click on the map, you click on the place, and then you get all sorts of information. And if there is oral history, you'll see it there, right? And you can click on it and it says here, duration 1 hour, 23 minutes. Some of them are longer. So it's a great, again, these are great resources that I highly, highly recommend that you share with others. At the museum, we're trying and not succeeding very well to try to offer our services to schools and universities to offer these resources, as we know there is a demand for the Palestinian narrative. They themselves agree that we never hear Palestinian voices. So we're offering these, and of course we'd like the museum to be there as resources. So please do approach non-Palestinians in your circles and offer them those resources. Another one which I thought was very well done was Arab American Stories, which was a joint project between PBS and the Arab American Museum in Detroit. Amazing museum. Diana Abu Ali is a good friend of mine. I'm very excited that she's there. She just joined last year. And what's great about it is that they do a good job in, rather than just telling your story from where you are, they're telling it from where the visitor is, right? So it is an Arab American story. It's a Palestinian American story, right? So here is the Arab American, and some of them are Palestinians, and they include Edward Said's sister and Dina Baydallah. And that's another good example of how do you help non-Palestinians, give them a window that speaks to them, right? We had several great experiences at the museum of, this African American guy who was helping us with management issues, and when he saw the picture of the occupation, destruction, he said, "Oh my God, this is reminding me of Detroit." He's from Detroit. And for us is that's exactly what we want. We want you to find your own connection to this. Another young student in one of the colleges here, when he saw the images in the Nakba section of people being evacuated from their village, he said, "Oh my God, this reminds me of my grandmother's story. She was a refugee in Europe in the Second World War." All those personal connections to Palestine that are coming from personal experiences that make the Palestinian story something that is relevant to the person who is visiting, sorry. Palestinians podcast, a great initiative by our friend Nadia Abu al-Azam. I think now she's doing this completely volunteering, but they have some amazing stories. I highly, highly recommend. One of my favorite stories is the Dubani family, a lovely story of a family that came to the US, a typical Palestinian American story that is proud of its heritage, and a lovely family. Again, she does it in a way that's very intimate. You can't but fall in love with the family. And in fact, the Dubani family are our partners here in DC. They do Zayt and Za'atar. So they come, they put Manaish and stuff in front of the museum, and that's how we lure people into the museum. And they also offer their auctions. It's lovely how food can seduce people into coming. Like total strangers know nothing about Palestine. What's Palestine? Oh, this tastes good. Go in. So we use tricks like that. It was funny. I was looking for Palestine Remembered, and I got an Australian Palestine Remembered. So there are a lot of those initiatives that are out there. And that's why when I spoke with Laura, I think we really need to have, or we should really encourage some sort of repository or some sort of hub where we broadcast it, so that all of these resources that are out there are somehow have one repository, and then somebody goes and organizes them, because these are so useful, because they are personal story. You cannot tell me that my story is wrong. You can argue with my argument, but you can't really argue with my narrative. And I think that's where the entry point is. But of course, they differ in quality. I try to stack them based on how good they were. Fasna, as I said, Friends of Sabil do a great job in doing these workshops for training Palestinians on how to tell their story. And I love how they bring an older person and a younger generation person, and they flesh it out and learn how to tell it. So I highly recommend you see that. The other one is Storycorps. So Storycorps, for those who don't know it, is, oh my God, I'm 13 minutes. I'll finish now. It's an American organization. They collect American stories, and the way they do it is it's a duo. Two people that are in relationship with each other, a parent and a child, two siblings, or husband and wife, whatever it is, and they talk about what's meaningful in their relationship. Beautiful program. It airs every Friday, and they have this specific program for communities, Asian Americans or whatever. They partner with Storycorps, and that's what we did. We partnered with them 2 years ago, and we did recordings, I believe, of 4 Palestinian stories, including the Dubani family. They brought the grandmother, and she spoke in Arabic. She told her story in Arabic, and it was recorded in Arabic. So they have, I think, a place in Boston, in Chicago, and I think in LA, like studios, so you can walk up there and ask for a recording, and they have mobile tours. The links are with you. I highly recommend you reach out to them, because again, we should, of course, we want to share our stories with the Palestinians, but the impact is really when these stories touch American lives. One of our resident artists, Ahmedat, very talented young guy from the Haitian refugee camp, came to the US, became an artist, and he tells the story of how one of his proudest moments was there was this family that was American, again, white American family, no Palestinian heritage. They liked his piece, they bought it, and he was very proud that he managed to sell it. And then like a year later, he bumped into them and he said, oh, let's have you over for dinner. And he did, he went over and he found the painting in their living room. And he said, I couldn't be prouder. I managed to get into, my painting made it into somebody's living room, into their intimate space. This is how you bring Palestine into people's hearts. And this is what we're trying to do at the museum. Finally, what I'll say about Yazan is that, again, I shared the YouTube. He speaks about this othering, and not othering, but like the hijacking of the voice of the subject. And the main theme here, I'm gonna show the picture, is that he went into the archives of National Geographic and looked at an edition of, I think, 1914 or 1938. And he discovered that the producers used a picture of this young lady, young Palestinian girl. Where is it? I can't find it. This one. He was trying to find a picture. He was trying to basically give a picture of what he thought Palestine looked like. So he had a picture of her smiling, but he didn't use that. He used this one where she's just looking down and she's very almost inanimate, right? And he said the impact of that Palestinians and the Orient becomes an object. And then when he looked in the archives, he discovered that there was this beautiful picture of her smiling and radiating. You can see her personality radiating from the picture that they chose not to use. And the impact on that, right? Now he did a tour with this, and in one, I don't know where he was, a woman identified the girl and said, oh my God, this is my grandmother. And I recognize her because that's my smile, right? So, I mean, amazing things that happen when you try to, so I tell this story because that wasn't the purpose Yazan had when he went into the archives, but amazing things happen when you start from a place of passion and commitment to values. I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Nizar, and thank you all for very engaging presentations. If everybody could stick with us for around 10 minutes or so, we are going to be proposing all the questions that you sent in, and I'll compile a few to everyone. Unfortunately, George had to leave, but we are going to be sending an email to everyone who attended with the links that Nizar sent, the information that every panelist had talked about, so you'll be able to get in touch with them. Maybe first, a question to everyone is, how can everyday Palestinians or just everyday individuals find familial artifacts, engage with familial artifacts, and use them either for research or for personal collections? That's something if you can consider to answer. And maybe for Odette specifically, the museum you opened, and I know that it closed, if you can talk about how can other communities support these initiatives in Latin America that collect the personal histories of communities that are in the diaspora, specifically in South America. Maybe let's start there. And I know that Dr. Mahasri had looked at one of the questions on Dar al-Fata. If you can talk a little bit about that. If the books and posters that you have presented are accessible anywhere online, how can people use them? Odette, maybe do you want to start first?
Yes, thank you. Two things. First, I forgot to tell something, an anecdote that actually answers the question. My father has always been very curious, right? That's why he engaged in this art. He had to reconstruct the history of mother of pearl art from the diaspora. So one of the things that happened is that among the 30,000 approx community here in Barranquilla, sometimes when people died, he inherited the archives, the family pictures, the books, the belongings of this person, because the family didn't give the value to these items. So they knew that there was this weird, bizarre person that collected all of these things that other people didn't give value to. And that's how he managed to gather a huge collection of archives from many families, not only our family, which, by the way, we're related to George, is the same family. But we have a lot of other family archives from families from Bejala, Betzahur, Bethlehem, which are the ones who compose the Palestinian diaspora in my city. So it's sad that these families didn't know their value, and that's why I say the personal is political in this case, because having pictures of pre-1948 Palestine is a very strong political statement. And that's something that I have been doing now, not with archives, pictures, letters, but with tatreez. So I have been, myself, collecting tatreez from families. We have dresses from before 1948 that people just left on their closets and they forgot about them. So that maybe can explain this connection between the families and their heritage. Maybe that can explain why our work has been very hard, because we have been alone. It has been a very personal engagement. We haven't had the support really of any institution or any organization, not from Colombia, not from Palestine. So for example, this museum that I spoke about, which has part of my father's collection and part of the pieces done by Taller Palestina, by the workshop, our family workshop in Colombia, is located at a church, in a church, right? So the priest gave us a space because it is sacred art, right? It's religious art. So they were open to give us a space, but it's closed because of administrative issues. And it's just now a warehouse where we keep some of that stuff. So we tried, my father's dream, actually he's here, his dream was to have a museum in Palestine, to bring back all of what he had collected to Palestine. But of course, it has been very hard. The bureaucracy, the lack of maybe interest, that's what's happened to us. Basically, the lack of consciousness of the majority of the diaspora. It's not the same as in Chile, okay? The case of Colombia is different. It's not that we're all the same. Well, he's here.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
We hope you're feeling better. We're so happy to have you with us as well. We shared your Jerusalem Mother of Pearl masterpiece on social media yesterday. Everybody loved it.
Thank you very much. Yeah. How are you, all of you?
Okay.
¿Quieres decir algo sobre la
No,
colección, algo que suene?
no, I many times I went to Bethlehem and talked to the Minister of Culture, the Minister of Anthropology, the mayor, also the Minister of Exterior Relations. That was about 10 years ago when I tried to the original collection that had been collected for 30 years to give it to Bethlehem back into a museum. But in that moment, the issues were not about museums or about cultural. There was a political problem, the negotiation with the Israelis, and that took the agenda and put everything else down. So nobody in that time could give an answer or to show interest. So I was kind of frustrated. So I went back to Colombia, and part of the original collection that I have, more than 500 pieces, I sold part of them to Ramiel Nimmer in Beirut. He has a museum. He's Palestinian from Ramallah, And I saw that in his hands, he will keep this heritage because this material being accumulated for 30 years really do not belong to Colombia. I mean, this is something foreign to the people in Colombia. There's no connection about more of Palestine, Bethlehem, whatsoever with the South American people. So I did that in the first part. I did that. I remain like 20% of the original collection still there, looking to finalize someone to buy. And the rest of the collection, that is the one done by Taller Palestina, original pieces, and I did some reproductions, very important masterpieces that I saw in many museums. That's still in Barranquilla, in the church. That, as Odette mentioned, we have this kind of problem also, that there is no interest of the government or the people here. So that collection has been closed for already 10 years, closed down to the public. It's very well exhibited. They built a very nice museum with vitrines and all this explanation, but the museum is totally closed to the public. Mm-hmm. So I asked Odette that there is an opportunity that I asked to the mayor last time in January, again, a possibility that to send this back to Bethlehem and to make the Museum of Mother of Pearl. They say yes, they were interested, but soon came the pandemic and all the problems stopped. Because also I signed by word, because that moment we couldn't do by paper, a commitment to transfer the Taller Palestina workers to Bethlehem and to start reteaching all the antique master techniques that have been forgotten. With a course of 50 people that the mayor was going to choose among the population to give opportunity to improve the way of life. Because Mother of Pearl now become really art craft, like Chinese, like Indians, like people, very cheap things for people, for tourists. But the real essence, the soul of the Mother of Pearl, the golden age that was on the 1905 to 1970s, that's disappeared completely. That's what I interesting, that the people in Bethlehem start learning again back all these techniques. Just for not extending more, just to give you an example. In 1905, in 1915, a large cross of 1.50 meters sold in San Diego, California, in the exposition of Panama, when they opened the Panama Canal, the main exposition, that piece was sold for $25,000. In that time, $25,000 was the equivalent of $500,000 of today. And that time, a house used to cost $5,000 and a car used to cost $800. So you imagine the value that the world have given to this kind of art at that time. $500,000 bring it to up to date. So my idea was that the people in Bethlehem, they are being exploited by the souvenir shops. They pay what they wanted, they put the prices, and they work really miserably. They don't even make, I don't know how they make to everyday how to survive. So my idea is to start teaching the old techniques where I can make them that a single piece that they can be done maybe in 3 days with the techniques that I have been learning, because I didn't only learn the antique techniques of Palestinian. I also went to all the other schools. I went to France, I studied in Italy, in Turkey, in Cairo, in Damascus. I learned everywhere. So today, why Taller Palestina is very successful making art pieces is because we learn from many, many, many schools. So this is my main interest to teach the people that one piece that they can make in 3 days, they can sell it for at least $2,000. And that's something that they can survive and again to revive this dying art. Because today there is only one person in the whole Palestine that keep the knowledge of the mother of pearl. Is Salim Atik. He was the professor for the old schools. He's the only one. After him, this complete will die.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
well, no, thank you so much for joining us. Really, this was very fascinating. And thank you, Odette, for bringing your father. I hope he feels better soon. I'm going to move on to Dr. Mahasri, and then we're going to conclude with Nizar. The webinar will be available on YouTube afterwards if anyone is interested, and I will leave my email in the chat if you would like to be connected to speakers or have any questions after the webinar. Dr. Mahasri, if you'd like to go ahead.
I think it's just to respond to several questions about whether some of this material is on the Signs of Conflict website. It's not. It's actually not. The Signs of Conflict was specifically to. There's some Palestinian posters that were concerned with the civil war in Lebanon. So this material that is for the book now that I've showed is not yet digitized, but there are projects to try to do that. For Dar al-Fatah, I think people are interested in this. Some of it kept on being reproduced, reprinted, some in Cairo when Dar al-Fatah relocated to Cairo in 77 and 82. So you can find some of that with the Ghassan Kanafani Foundation in Beirut. They have not all the collection, but some of the reprints. They're not as good quality, but they're good enough if you want. Recently, the American University of Beirut's Special Collection Archives are collaborating with the Palestinian Museum on a project. They have received a collection of Dar al-Fatah, like as a donation, and they are trying to also digitize that, and it will be available between digitized by AUB, but it's a collection of the Palestinian Museum. And there is a project that is of an oral history about Dar al-Fatah. So there is a new recent attention, so we shouldn't worry about Dar al-Fatah. I think that's important. There's a project of oral history about all the people who participated in Dar al-Fatah and made it happen. And I think that will be available online soon through the American University of Beirut's part of their oral history project.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Nizar, if you would like to address the question, and then we can conclude.
Sure. So what you can do, definitely there are these resources. I just want to really emphasize that, again, we are not experts. It was all out of love of Palestine. And I want to emphasize out of frustration that other stuff has not been working. And here I want to be like, show vulnerability and say, like, I'm a person who worked in NGO in Palestine, then was part of the Palestinian negotiating team, then was part of the Palestinian delegation here. And it took a young Palestinian from Bethlehem who was just a fresh graduate in business school to come to DC. I think he was like 26, to come up with this idea. And I was like, oh my God, that's an amazing idea. Of all the projects, I mean, I'm 46 now, and of all the projects I've worked in, this is the most exciting. And when he told me about the museum, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what we need to do. Of all the things we could be doing, this is it, right? So the lesson there is, it is an emergence and it is a discovery. We need to start from a place of love, a place of why we care about Palestine, and my own discovery of how I love Palestine in ways different from how my father loved Palestine. I was born and raised in Dubai and found my own Palestine. So the people that were talking about like Odette's challenges and stuff, it's all about coming together, starting something, and then things come together. When we started the museum, we discovered that the Ramallah Federation here in the US has been for over 5 years collecting their Ramallah people's artifacts, and they wanted to partner with us because of economies of scale. Why create 2 museums, right? So only by doing that do we discover, and now the idea is to have we would be the hub, and then we help others. There's another one in San Diego, which is the Palestine House. We help them in registering as a 501c3. So you are not alone. We are not alone. It really is not rocket science. It is just a labor of love. So I highly, and one thing I just wanted to add, comment what Laura said, which is, if you have any collections or know of any collections, please send them Laura's way so that we have one address where this stuff is. I'm a big fan of IPS. I think it's one of our the institutions that I'm proudest about that we can show off. But it makes sense also to have one contact person for all these things. Thank you very much. And I look forward to getting news about new initiatives across the globe.
Thank you so much, Nisa. It is all for love of Palestine. So that is a beautiful conclusion. Thank you to all the panelists who joined us. And please have a nice evening, afternoon, or morning. Bye. Bye-bye.